All right. Hi, everybody. What a joy it is to be here. This is such a great topic, and it's fun to have everybody interested in this topic. So thanks for your attention. I'm going to tell you about inferring what you think from what you do. And just to begin, I want to thank all the people who've participated in this research. A lot of different threads that I'll be talking about, and I'll only have time to kind of give a top-level summary of some of it, but some of it I'll go into greater detail. And two of my postdocs up here are in the audience today. Zhongwei is going to have a flash talk later, and Minhei is working on related things. So you can pester them with more questions about this if you like it. And if you don't like it, come see me. Okay, outline. I'm going to present a theoretical framework for thinking about inference, how inferences are represented by neurons, coding, and action. And then I'll use that framework, or motivated by that framework, we'll talk about a tool that we've developed that I think will be very useful for neuroscientists who would like to think about complex behaviors and how you can go all the way from sensory to motor through cognition. And I'll tell you a little bit of some results about applying that framework, but mostly I'm going to present you the framework and the tool. Okay, so I grew up with sensory neuroscience. I actually chopped some retinas out when I was a graduate student. And what you do in sensory neuroscience is you measure from the brain, and then you compare that to something else you can measure, which is the input that you control, typically. In motor neuroscience, you'll measure the neurons, and you'll compare that to what the muscles are doing, what the joints are doing. So in both cases, these are comparing two things that you can measure experimentally. But I think many of us are interested in thoughts, and how are you going to measure a thought? You can measure the neural activity, and what are you going to compare it to? So we'd like to provide some ways of estimating thoughts based on what you see and what you do. It's going to start with the world. We imagine that the brain is modeling the world. It's a good theme. I think you should have a colloquium on that. And so the world is going along, and it's updating itself over time, going through the laws of physics. And we don't get to observe the world. We don't get to directly apprehend the world itself. We get to observe the world mediated by our sense data. And so there are our observations. And those observations will generate for us some beliefs. Oops. There are the beliefs, okay? So we have some beliefs about the world, and that's in our brain. And all this stuff is outside, and the observations of the interface. Now, if everything in the world corresponded to something in the brain in some kind of one-to-one manner, that would be one thing, but that's not the way the world is. Instead, events in the world correspond to many possible neural activity patterns in the brain, and conversely, one activity pattern in the brain corresponds to many possible events in the world. So that means that neural computation, what the brain is going to do with this sense data, is inherently statistical. That makes our lives more difficult in some ways, but it provides opportunities. It gives us an option for finding interesting mathematical predictions based on that idea of performing some kind of statistical inference. So going back to our model of the world, now we have, we're going to describe the world as a Markov world. That's actually true. The physics of the world is Markovian. That is, the state of the world at the next time, if we're going to work in quantum Planck scale discrete time, which I always do, is going to evolve based on its previous state. So if you tell me the position and momentum of all the particles in the universe, I could tell you what's going to happen for the foreseeable future, if it were classical. If it's quantum, tell me the wave function, I'll tell you the future. Okay, so that's the Markov property. Actually, there's a lot of uncertainty there, so we don't do that in practice. And so we are going to accommodate that uncertainty by allowing for a probability distribution of future states given the past history of the universe. So there's P of X given all of the things that happened in the past. And the Markov property assumes that that current state, X of t, can be summarized not by the whole history of the universe, but just by the instant before. Okay? So this is a fundamental thing that a lot of people do when modeling prediction and modeling dynamics, and we're going to do that too. Given that knowledge, we're also going to characterize our observations, and we will imagine that those observations are measurements of the current state, P of O given X. Okay? And so with those two, we can actually describe how your belief about the world should evolve over time, given that your observations are not perfectly reliable and don't tell you everything. So the way this works is you imagine that you had a posterior probability distribution yesterday. You did a good job of figuring out what was there. Yesterday's posterior becomes today's prior. So we take yesterday's posterior, which is what you think is there from the previous time state, given your past observations, and then you predict the future. You step one step forward in time, and you imagine all different things that might have been yesterday. What would they lead to today? So this whole term here is your prior. And then you get a new observation, and the product of those two is going to give you, is proportional to the posterior probability of what's happening right now, given everything you've seen, including the most recent observation. Okay, this is standard Markov chain stuff, hidden Markov models, but it's a good foundation. Now, here's the world. It's just a dot, right? Well, the world is structured, and so don't let anybody tell you anything differently. Not anything is possible, and you need to know that, because otherwise you'd be overwhelmed, okay? So we assume a structure in the world, and that is what allows us to interpret our ambiguous sense data. So here I'm going to appeal to the mathematical framework called probabilistic graphical models. Who here has heard of a probabilistic graphical model? Okay, so a good fraction of the audience, that's good. So what you do with a probabilistic graphical model is you simplify a joint distribution over the world given your observations in terms of a bunch of simpler products, which are smaller interacting variables, smaller groups of interacting variables. And the groups are connected in a graph. So this is a probabilistic graphical model. Each circle is a variable, x1, x2, x3, let's say. And they're connected by lines, or in more general cases, squares, edges and hyperedges. And the squares represent these factors, which couple together the variables that they touch. Okay, so here, this is a factor that connects x1, x2, and x3. And sometimes you have a factor that's not connected to anything. They call that a singleton factor. And that could be a way of providing evidence, directly observable evidence about the variables. Like x3, you get phi3, and that tells you something about x3 by itself. One common example that people often use is a pairwise Markov random field. And this is basically you have a bunch of variables that are each connected two at a time. And so here we have a chain. We have 1, 2, and 3. 1 and 3 are not connected, but they interact mediated by 2. So 1 influences 2, 2 influences 3, and so 1 and 3 can be correlated. Now, if you're trying to figure out what's there, what is x1, what is x3, you can do that, but you have to account for all of the variables that might be influencing the variable of interest. So this evidence about x3 has to flow up through the graph to influence x1. So you can do that by sending information between the variables, depending on how strongly they're connected in this causal model or statistical model that you have of the world. Now, as those messages or that information is flowing around, you can imagine that you unfold that as a dynamical system in time. Okay, so there's our temporal system, and I'll just put some edges there this way. Now information is flowing from left to right. And that information is propagating, let's say, from 1 to 2 at the next time. That's what that edge is. And 2 has some influence of its own previous time. This particular graph is symmetric, so if A influences B, then B influences A in the same way. But it doesn't have to be like that, so we can make something asymmetric. So here we have, let's see, 1 influencing 2, 2 influences 3, and 3 influences 1 again, but not the other way around. So this could be either a dynamics for computation in a static world, or it could be a model of the dynamics of the world itself, or combines the two. Okay? So here is this is the way that variables influence each other over time. So let's push that up to the top of the slide and go back to this graph that we had before of the world evolving over time. And now we see, well, okay, that 1 dot for the world is actually represented by 3 dots, is 3 variables in this simplified world. Now, for the belief in your brain, you would want to have more than 1 variable also. And so here's some variables. You don't have to have the same number. They don't have to correspond. Some of them could be missing. Some of them could be nonsense. But there's a set of variables that you believe something about. Okay, this is the part of the content of your thought. And so the dynamics here of your beliefs should in some way parallel the dynamics of the world. And just as the observations are supposed to influence your belief here, we're going to put the arrows directly down to the different variables there. So you have a bunch of observations, but they're going to influence all the beliefs. Now, if we're not living in a deterministic world, we have some uncertainty. So that uncertainty should play a role. So we have a stochastic update. And this is either a reflection of the true nature of the world, or it's some summary of our own assumptions. That's fine. But what it means is that we're not just thinking about a single point estimate about each variable that might be out there. We actually have some uncertainty. And this has been shown many times in different kinds of behavioral experiments. And I'll just give you one example from my own childhood. Who here has ever caught a firefly? Yeah, it's fun, isn't it? So here you are, and a firefly flashes on. It's this glow-in-the-dark bug, and then you run over and you try to catch it without smushing it. But it disappears, and so when it disappears, and they usually come out at dusk, so it's pretty dark, you don't know where it is anymore. So if you want to catch it, the best thing to do is not to go over exactly where you think the firefly is, your best guess, because 50% of the time it's going to be behind you. Instead, you want to step back a little bit, give yourself the opportunity to take another observation. Right? So you're going to stop there. And how far back you'll be depends on how much uncertainty you have about that world. So uncertainty influences our actions. So this is a ubiquitous phenomenon that people have described many times, and I think that this is a source of great mathematical predictions. Now, if we go back to this model, the schematic here, now if we're going to capture an uncertainty, now we have to have at least 2 numbers per variable. 1, what your best guess is, and 2, how confident you are about it. So you can have multiple numbers that characterize that. And in fact, the numbers could be, so now there's more than 1 circle per variable. And you can have variables, circles that represent covariance and joint uncertainty, and lots of different numbers there. Okay, so that's an important aspect of what our brain is processing. And we'd like to know, what is that representation? Okay, so stochastic, so randomness. The world is also nonlinear. So the variables of interest are nonlinearly related to each other and the causal variables that we care about. If you could get by with linear computation, you don't need a brain. You could just go right from your eyes to your muscles and be done with it, because the product of 2 linear operations is a linear operation. But that's not the way the world is. So you have nonlinearities there. So these influences between your beliefs at different times should also be nonlinear. Now, it may be difficult to capture exactly the physical laws going from one time to another, so it may be mediated in the brain by a few steps that are simpler nonlinearities that when you combine them, it's going to give you more of what you want. It'll give you a closer approximation to the physics of the world. And moreover, it doesn't have to be the same number of nodes in your brain as variables that you care about. We, in fact, don't think that's the case. So instead, we have a whole stack of neurons. They're all mixed together, encoding all of the stuff that we think we care about. And they're interacting all together. So I'm not drawing all the lines, but drawing a band there. And so we have a whole bunch of bands that are all connecting these neurons together. And together, they are doing whatever kind of prediction and inference and absorbing all the observations that you have. There's not a specific set of neurons that are dedicated to a belief necessarily, but that information is in there. And if you want to extract it, well, you could decode it from those neurons, but the dynamics themselves are just running through the neurons. And so, okay, we also need to use that information, not just to generate beliefs about the world, but also to act upon those beliefs. So how are you going to act upon those beliefs? Well, we're going to talk about that soon. But one thing is that you don't have a belief neuron that's going to then drive your action. Instead, it's going to be delocalized, right? That just like the beliefs are not represented by neurons in the brain, nor are the actions. So I've erased all the lines that are not the real causal lines in the brain. And so the flow is you have a world that generates observations, that influences neurons, and we can consider that to be beliefs about the world, but really those beliefs are creating nonlinear dynamics that produce our actions. So that's the flow. Okay, this is the way that I think it's useful to think about these. These neurons are complex, nonlinear, distributed codes about the things that we care about. And there's all sorts of intrinsic dynamics that have not just to do with the world, the outside world, but also our body. Okay, so that's kind of a description of the way I think about this. These are redundant neurons, and you need some different mathematics to handle a code like this. And this is things that people who work on deep learning are still trying to interpret, even networks that we can fully observe. How do they represent the things that we care about? So we have some ideas about that I'm not going to talk to you about today, but I just wanted to introduce that framework. So let's erase that and go back to the simpler view, knowing that these beliefs are really composites of many neurons. And the summary is that latent variables that we care about are distributed across many neurons, and they perform some implicit inference and select actions through the nonlinear dynamics. And I think it's useful to think of that as what they're doing to the statistics that describe your beliefs. Okay? So there's more to chew on there, but that's the basic idea. There's a match between the world and the brain. Now, what if, so that whole edifice is all assuming some kind of optimality, essentially. We know the structure of the world, there's a match to the brain. What if the brain's wrong? Well, we know it's wrong. But once we leave the regime of optimality, which has been really useful for many cases, like we saw a great example of that with Bill's talk just before, what kind of guidance do we have if something is not optimal? It's like it could be anything else. So maybe we can weaken the notion of optimality and say, well, it's wrong but rational, okay? So that is, you might have the wrong model, but do the best you can given that wrong model, okay? That's what we're going to assume. And let me give you an example of this. Okay, participation. So how many people drive here? Okay, good. So let's play a game where we're driving our car down the highway. You're in the right lane, and I want you to hold on to your steering wheel. Okay, everybody grab your steering wheel. Okay, now you're going to change lanes from the right lane to the left lane. You're going to close your eyes and imagine all the movements you're going to make with the steering wheel to do it. Ready? Change lanes now. Okay, you're dead. You're all dead. Why are you dead? You're dead because what you did was this. You turned and then you evened out. What does that do to the car? You turn and now you're going diagonally across traffic. You're going head on, you went past the target lane. You have to make an S turn, right? I presume many of you drive often. How come we don't know that? Nobody succeeds. You did it right? Oh, I missed that. Congratulations, you're the second person ever. We typically don't know that because we don't drive with our eyes shut. So you'll have to explain how you know that. And when we drive with our eyes shut, we don't need to make a model of the future. We don't need to predict because we're operating in closed loop. If we're going too far, we can correct it. Okay? So this is an example where we don't need to dedicate more resources to having an optimal model to predict the future and act accordingly, because in the regime that we care about, it's rational to have the wrong model. It's easier, and it works just fine. Okay, so that's kind of a motivation for how we might think of a suboptimal rational model. So here's a framework which is kind of wrapping up that little trellis that I showed you before. We have a brain, it has some beliefs. The beliefs are updated according to some internal model of the world, and that generates some values. It's also updated based on observations, so the new sense data coming in. Those values and what you think the state of the world is tells you what you should do to maximize your own personal assessment of value. Those actions affect the world. The world gives you more rewards, hopefully, less costs, and more observations, and the cycle goes around. So if this is our model of a behaving animal, let's measure it. Okay, we'll put it in a box. We'll take videos, we'll measure things, and we'll do some math. Okay, this is basically Bayesian theory of mind. And there's some precedent here, including by Rebecca and Josh's work. Very nice stuff looking at how, and you described a little bit of it, how can we assess what the beliefs and what the values of an agent are based on what it does. So let me describe to you how we do it. We're going to start with a Markov decision process. So we already talked about Markov chains. So that, if you have a Markov decision process, you have a world that's Markovian, and you have a goal that you'd like to achieve. So you find what actions to take at every time step to achieve your best goal and maximize your outcome, your total expected future rewards. Okay? The current world state in this framework is fully observed. You know what's out there, but you don't know the future. The future is unknown. And so from what you know, which are transitions, rewards, and the policy is the way of describing what actions to take, you can assess value, and then you can make your value consistent with your policy. That is, your policy of choosing actions is whatever maximizes your value. You close the loop, you can do that in a recursive formula, and you can find out how to use your knowledge about the world to do as well as you can. That's a Markov decision process. A small modification that actually makes things really hard is a partially observable Markov decision process. So here, the current world state is not uncertain. Before you didn't know the future, now you don't even know the present, okay? So you get partial observations about things. And so, weak sensory evidence, you don't get to measure everything, et cetera. But your current uncertainty is known. You know what you don't know. It's your future uncertainty that you don't know now. So you don't know what the future state will be, and you don't know how uncertain you'll be about it. So you have to plan on both of those. Turns out that this is equivalent to a Markov decision process where the state that you're tracking is not the state of the world, but the state of your own beliefs, the belief state. And you have belief transitions. And instead of rewards, you have expected rewards based on your own belief. And so again, you can construct a policy and a value that are consistent with each other to give you the best solution to this POMDP, partially observable MDP, Markov decision process. Okay, so this is the model that we assume that agents have. They're going along, doing the best they can, subject to their model. What is their model? That's where inverse POMDP comes in. We're going to assume a rational agent with the wrong assumptions about the world, but given those assumptions, they're doing the best they can. And we would like to infer which internal model best explain the observed actions we watch them make and the observed observations we watch them make. And then we're going to use that model to estimate belief dynamics over time, which are the thoughts that we would like to characterize in the brain. How do those thoughts evolve? How do the neurons represent them? Previous work has done things related to this, but not the way that we've done it and not doing the full system. People have looked at inverse optimal control. So if I tell you the reward functions, what dynamics do you assume? Or inverse reinforcement learning. So if you know the dynamics, what costs and goals do you have? And that's what Rebecca presented. But we do both. We do the full inverse POMDP. And this is model-based because if anything goes, you can't infer anything. But within the structure of some task and maybe a super task that's a broader class, you can actually solve this problem. And so this is the work that Zhongwei has done, and she'll present you a little bit more about that in her flash talk, and you can talk to her about the poster. In brief, the kind of question that we're asking and applying this to is a foraging task. We're actually designing experiments for real animals to do these tasks. So foraging, you're trying to get some food, let's say, and you have a choice. Should I eat more berries from this bush, or have I eaten most of the good ones and it's time to go to the next one? And if so, where? Moreover, you don't really get to observe everything, so you have to make decisions in the presence of uncertainty. We model this as a task where you have a box that has food. There's actually a little box, you push a button. Food may or may not show up, depending on whether it's available. So you could think red is like ripe. And so the underlying dynamics of the food availability is a telegraph process, a switching process, like Morse code, do, 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 but slower. So here's the blue and the red. Red is available. Well, you have an agent. Agent opens the box, finds the food because it's available, and eats it. Now the food's gone. Now you have to wait. Wait till the next food. Okay, so, but you don't see this. So you wait and food became available, but then it disappeared again. It's kind of like, fishing or something. Fish got away. And then you open the box then, oh, sorry, no food. Okay? And then the food becomes available again. This is the one box task. If you put in a second box, now you have the option to travel to the other box after you got your food if you want, or anytime. And that has some cost, so you have to make it worth it, depending on how far the box is, how hard it is to get there. And so maybe you got to the other box when food was waiting for you, and yes, you got your food. Moreover, you might get some sensory evidence about that. So when the reward is not visible, you have to rely on your memory. But in this case, you might get some weak, uncertain, unreliable data about that. And we've designed that in the form of some color cue because we're recording from V4, so we think we can pull out some of those signals while we're looking at them. Okay. Now we're going to do this inverse POMDP thing, where we have the two-box task, and we're going to learn the parameters. What are the parameters? Well, we have the appearance and disappearance rates of the food. We have the strength of the evidence. That's the reliability of the color cue. You have the cost of traveling between the boxes, the cost of opening the boxes. Pushing the button a lot of times can get tiring. And then all of that's expressed in units of banana or reward, whatever your reward is. And we maximize, the whole purpose here is to maximize the probability of everything that we get to observe as an experimentalist. We're doing theory of mind with the animal, find the best model. Observe the actions and observations, estimate the parameters for the dynamics, uncertainties, rewards, and action costs, infer the latent beliefs that dictate their actions, and optimize the model, which we do by the popular algorithm known as expectation maximization. So this is the complete data log likelihood. We maximize this quantity. It's guaranteed to give us improvement. And so here is our optimization surface in terms of two of the parameters that we optimize. And you can go over to this location and you find this is the best explanation, the model that best explains what the animal does when they do it. The real animal is down here, but the limited data that we had suggested that this is a better fit for that data. So you always have some intrinsic uncertainty, and we can optimize this model within the intrinsic uncertainty provided by the data. Now we can see, is this a good model? Well, we can look at different kinds of values of what's a good choice, what's a bad choice. So here's some true value for food at box 1 versus food at box 2 as a function of the belief. And here's the inferred value. So if it's no food there, oh, do I have that backwards? Maybe I have this backwards. So anyway, there's a match between these two, sorry about that. The true value of the function and the inferred value match when we do this optimization. And we look at the belief dynamics over time, and the belief that there's food in box 1 is on the vertical axis, time is on the horizontal axis, and the blue dots represent the actual agent's belief at every time. And the grayscale tells you, what do we think they think? Okay, so posterior over posteriors, and you see that there's a nice match. So it works. This is, if the task is too complicated, it's going to be intractable, but for the kind of tasks that we think are useful for modern neuroscience, we can actually solve this problem. We can also extend it to include some more things, like I think what Anne is going to talk about later, using hierarchical models. So you might have a model where the rates change of finding food, let's say. And we can learn those parameters from the same evidence. And we might even assume a more general structure, not matching the task, but allowing for some superstitions that the animal thinks, well, maybe the boxes are correlated, or maybe the past is more influential, it's not a Markov process. So you can structure different kinds of assumptions this way and infer those. So I'm going to end with just a few results. And so these are places where we've begun to apply this framework. One of them is the firefly task, which I already told you a little bit about, but instead of doing it in my childhood to my brain, we're actually doing this with monkeys catching fireflies in virtual reality, and humans catching fireflies in virtual reality. And it's fun. We even have a whole moving chair where when you steer with the joystick, it actually gives you the feeling of moving around, which is entertaining. So the goal is to stop on the Firefly. It's there, but then it disappears. And you have to navigate by optic flow, because the triangles that you see on the ground plane, they disappear. And we have to track the different variables. So when you look at how people actually perform at this task, if the real Firefly is there, people overshoot. But they overshoot by different amounts, and we'd like to figure out what model do they have in mind for the dynamics of this task. What do they think the real dynamics are? Now, in the field, people thought that a leaky integrator model would explain why people overshoot, that you think you've gone farther than you have because you have forgotten some of the distance you've already traveled. And we find that that's not a good model compared to an alternative false model, which is that you have you're biased towards thinking speeds are slower than they really are. So we can recover that bias. So the leaky model gives you this, if the target is on the diagonal line, as target distance gets farther, this is your response distance. You overshoot by that. And the slow model, this other alternative model, is overshooting for short distances, but starts to undershoot for long distances. And that's, in fact, what humans do. And so our model has the same behavior, and this is coming about by using an inverse optimal control model. We also have monkeys that are doing this foraging task with the two boxes. Here's a box, here's a box. Here's a monkey with a wireless transmitter on its head. So we can let the monkey move freely in the box and make it a naturalistic task, which is quite an engineering feat. I have no credit to me for any of that. It's really impressive. But the monkey goes back and forth and tries to get the data, tries to get the rewards. And the rewards have different schedules. And we can measure from prefrontal cortex and other brain areas what it's doing. And we find that in the brain, in fact, you do find representations of these beliefs. So here's some preliminary data where we're trying to decode from all the neurons that we recorded, what is the probability of getting food from that box? And we find that we can actually decode it. And there's some other factors that we can also decode in there. For example, what's the recent history of getting successful rewards versus failures? And what was the schedule? Was this a good box or a bad box in general? These things are recoverable from the neural data. And what we would like to do next is figure out whether the dynamics of these decoded variables match what we assert they should be according to this behavioral model. All right, so conclusion, wrapping up. I presented to you some kind of cartoon version of a framework, a mathematical framework for inference and control. That is, how can you describe how agents perform on complex naturalistic tasks and use the observations they have to figure out what's out there and use beliefs and learn if you do this in a hierarchical way. We talked a little bit about coding in the sense of how could those beliefs be represented, embedded in neural activity, and how the actions and the dynamics could be implemented by nonlinear dynamics between the neurons in these redundant codes. So there's some work on that you could read. And we provide a tool which allows you to, for these pretty general cases, figure out what an animal thinks from what it does. And we've started applying this to interesting tasks from behavioral neuroscience. And we're seeing some initial evidence of distributed codes for these beliefs. And so I think that as a framework, combining things that a lot of other people have done also, I think we're moving in a good direction to find out the brain representation of mind and these models of the world. So with that, I'll thank again my awesome collaborators. Thank you all, and thanks for your attention.